Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back, and now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. So we are coming into another week of our sex and intimacy month. And today I am bringing you one of my favorite people to talk about sex with and intimacy, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. You may follow her on Instagram. If you don't, I think you definitely should. And I also think you should read her book, which is amazing, called Taking Sexy Back: How to Own Your Sexuality and Create the Relationships You Want. Hello. Dr. Alexandra Solomon she's amazing. She's a clinical assistant professor at Northwestern University and a licensed clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. And not only is she an amazing writer and psychologist, and she writes articles and chapters for leading academic journals and books in the field of marriage and family, but also she literally teaches a college course on how to be in relationship. Like, you know how we always say, like, they don't teach this shit in school. Well, guess what? They do. But you have to go to Northwestern to take it. That's like one of my favorite things about her. But I love her book. I strongly, highly cannot recommend highly enough that everybody reads Alexandra's book. It just came out recently. Again, it's called Taking Sexy Back: How to Own Your Sexuality and Create the Relationship You Want. So I'm just going to actually let this one go. I'm not going to talk anymore because I think my conversation with Alexandra will speak for itself. So enjoy. All right, Dr. Alexandra Solomon, thank you so much for being here and talking about taking your sexy back.
It's so good to be with you, Kate. I am so ready for this conversation.
Oh my God, I am too. And I think so many women are. And there's so many aspects to this that I want to dive into. But tell me sort of so you wrote this book, which is amazing. What was it that sort of prompted you to write this, to talk about this sexuality in these terms?
Right. I think it was a number of factors coming together, right? So I'm 2 decades into my career as a couples therapist and a relationship educator. I'm 2 decades into being a wife. And I really enjoy translating what academics are working on, what educators are working on, and translating it to the general public. And then this book, in some ways, this book is a circling back to the things I was really passionate about as a younger woman in college and in grad school, and the intersection of gender and power and sex and relationship. It was a fascinating book to write and to be part of, but I was called to do it. And I started working on it right as the Me Too movement was taking off, right? So that was not a new term, but Alyssa Milano certainly made it go viral. Fall of 2017, really. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was the right moment for a book like this, where we're talking so much about the pain and the abuses that happen around sex, that I also wanted to make sure we were talking about the pleasures of sex and the reclamation, and us taking back something that always should have been ours the whole time, which is our relationship to our own erotic self. And so that's really where the book starts. It is couples therapy for the reader, between the reader and her erotic self. Like, who are we with each other? And that has to happen before anything else, really.
I love that. I love that. When I talk to my clients about sexuality, like particularly women who have gotten divorced and then had a relationship outside of their marriage, like the first one that's sort of sexually awakening, right? It's a very common theme, right? We all have that, right? And they have this sort of sexual reawakening with a partner, with someone new. And then that relationship doesn't last, and they're really upset and scared about losing the sexuality that they discovered with their partner. And I always say to them that that's yours, that what you found with this other partner and what you glimpsed with that other partner is an aspect of yourself that if you actually if you dig into and you start to own it and claim it as your own, then it's portable. And that goes with you wherever you go. Like, it doesn't belong to him. And one of the things that you talk about a lot in your TED Talk and in the book is about agency and women's agency over their own sexuality, right? And so often I think we attach it to another person. But what you talk about first is actually attaching it to ourselves.
Right. That's right. That's right. It's the inevitable cascade of events that happens when we launch girls into womanhood with inadequate sex education, right? So if we go into adulthood, we go into a marriage having never had a sense that our sexuality is our own, because how could we? Because 10,000 years of patriarchy have given us the message that sex is a duty.
Mm-hmm.
Sex is something that is on the list of shoulds and needs to and has to around what it means to be a female partner, especially a female partner to a male partner. Yeah. And so if that becomes our first experience of our sexual self, and then it oftentimes is an aspect of the erosion of the marriage, right? So we're not healed within that first marriage potentially. And in fact, that first marriage then maybe reinforces, perpetuates, there's disconnect, there's disengagement, there's resentment, And so then I know what you're saying, that then post-divorce, it feels like, wow, this man awoke this in me. Mm-hmm. And it's again, which of course that would be the thought, because it is this idea that men give us orgasms, right? Men make us feel good. So there's and I love that then she's there with you to rewrite that story and can have reflected back to her, actually, you entered into this experience differently, right? You somehow, off the layers of trauma and pain and disconnect that were from your marriage, and you are discovering this part of you. And so I love helping women connect with their sexy no matter where they are. I would love for us to raise the next generation of girls to not have to reconnect, but to have that from the get-go.
Absolutely. Right? Oh my God, wouldn't that be amazing? That would just be incredible. Let's talk about that. Like, how do we do that? Like, so you talk about sex education and how it's not good, right? And I love that you talk in your TED Talk about being a child of the 80s and getting under your covers on Sunday nights and listening to Dr. Ruth, because hello, me too. Oh, hell yeah. I love it. For everyone else who's much younger than Alexandra and I are, Dr. Ruth Westheimer was a sex educator, and she was like, when in the 80s, she was like in her 70s, right? Wasn't she? Like, is she still alive?
Yeah, she's still alive. Oh yeah, she's alive. She's well. She's tweeting about the pandemic. Potentially she was our age when she was doing that in the 80s.
No, we always felt like she was so old, but she also has this very thick accent. She's like,
and just in a deep wisdom, right? A deep wisdom. Like she's a petite woman, but you couldn't knock her over. You try. So she's rock solid. So yes, I'm sure to our teen ears, she sounded like just a wise soul. But she was and is.
And she was the only person that I had ever heard talking about sex, just like clinically as it was, right? She's like, you touch your clitoris, like whatever she would touch. She just like talk about it on the radio, right? It was awesome. But for us, we're hiding under the covers and we're listening to this, right? We had some like public access channels with like Robin Bird and things like that, right? That was porn, essentially, soft porn. But other than that, like no one was talking to us about this. So, right? Will you talk a little bit about how we received sex education and how we are changing and shifting the education that girls are getting and what we should see.
Right. Well, unfortunately, the sort of punchline here is things haven't gotten better. In fact, in some ways, you could argue they've gotten worse. So we're, Gen X, we are part of a blip we were educated around sex during the AIDS crisis, right? So we were the first generation to get the very, very front-loaded, like, have sex and you could die messaging.
Right. That was fun.
That was good times. And again, and just I think that probably on the spectrum of things, my sex ed was pretty decent in that I was given certainly the sex is dangerous message, but I wasn't given anything about the sex is sinful message. And I was so disturbed to hear, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of younger, millennials and then current college students about their sex education experiences, and was pretty consistently horrified around direct teaching that to have sex outside of marriage, to have multiple sexual partners, makes you unlovable, is one message, right? Dirty, unlovable, nobody will want you. But then there's a more subtle message that is sometimes given around, if you have multiple sexual partners, you lose your ability to attach to people. You can't love and be loved anymore, which is another just sort of twist on the fear-based theme. And that's continued. In fact, under the Obama administration, money started to be shifted away from this abstinence-only sex education, which the research shows, up, down, and sideways, abstinence-only sex education does not delay onset of sexual activity. What it does do is spike the chances that you will have an unintended pregnancy, contract an STI, because of course you don't know how to prepare yourself, and you create a split. It's sort of like, I'm not going to, and then when you do, you're not ready for it because you haven't done the steps.
Right.
Okay, so that's not working. We were talking to kids about how to negotiate. Here's what I'm ready for. Here's what I'm not ready for. Teach them how to prevent STIs. The data was trending. It was going down. We were starting to make some progress. And then, of course, under the Trump administration, that money is now getting filtered back towards abstinence-only sex education. So it's become this thing that is about basically, sex is an aspect of being a human. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's become ideological. It's become politicized. And so we still are not at a place where in the public system, there's any sort of unitary, agreed upon way of doing this. So cool to see how the private sector is stepping in. It's cool to see that parents are taking this under their own wing and doing it themselves because public sector can't get their act together. But it's unfortunate. And if you Google, what's a blowjob, you're going to get taken to Pornhub. There's nothing, I don't think we have to be anti-porn to say that our kids deserve better than.
Yes.
Porn being their sex education teacher.
Absolutely.
And I have an undergraduate at Northwestern who's just finishing up her honors thesis, and she talked to a bunch of queer college students about their experiences with both sex education and porn, and it was fascinating. So we are, for as bad as it is for straight kids around sex ed, it's even more horrifying for queer kids, right? Sex ed is not, by and large, inclusive, and
right.
So porn is for sure filling in, those absences.
Mm. Yeah.
So that's where we are. It's not great. And people of all genders deserve to grow up with a message that your sexual self is a part of you and that you deserve pleasure and that adolescents can fall in love and feel love and have experiences of dating. I think that we do so much to minimize adolescent love and adolescent relationships. We tell them that that's not real love and
puppy love, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it does them many favors.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about sort of how the patriarchy here's the right? The patriarchy is bad for both men and women, right? Like, it's not like ultimately, like in the long term, it's not good for either one of us. So when we talk about, certainly for me, when I talk about smashing the patriarchy, this is not an anti-male thing, which I'm very cautious to have to state. Unfortunately, I have to state it, right? But the patriarchy has impacted, I think, women's sexual ownership and sexual power. And we've done that. It's done that in about 7,000 different ways, right? Like through body shame, through, $72 billion diet industry telling us that we should that our bodies are not okay, in all sorts of ways. How do you see it as? affecting and impacting us in this way sexually.
Yeah, and I hear you. I talk about patriarchy in the very same way, that it hurts all of us. And it really is. It's a way of enlisting male allies to be really thoughtful about who do they not get to be because they get stuck inside of this man box, right? And what are the burdens that they carry and the limitations on their ability to love and be loved because of all of this messaging. So I think it's very real that it hurts all of us, and that there are very subtle ways that we all reinforce it, right? So one like piece of data that I always refer to is that we start touching our boys by the time a little boy is 3 years old. We are all touching him less. And that's mothers and fathers are touching. We touch our little boys less. We touch our little girls. So there's ways in which that women become the foot soldiers of the patriarchy, right? And we, of course, grow up feeling like we have to make sure that our boys are going to not be marginalized, humiliated, shamed, left out. And then, of course, the women that those boys grow up to love end up paying the price, right? What it takes to be a good partner is pretty antithetical to how our culture defines being a good man. Because to be a good partner, you have to be able to collaborate, own your vulnerability, admit when you're wrong, cry, lean into your feelings. And so I spend much of my week, working. Most of my couples are straight couples. So I spend much of my week with these marriages that are deeply, deeply in trouble. And I'm doing very basic empathy training with husbands, right? We're like breaking down empathy into its component parts, and we're working on how to respond to your wife's needs, requests, yearnings, without having the need be somehow evidence that you are not enough, or that you are wrong.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Exactly. And how receptive do you find that men go to couples therapy with their wives because they have to? And then how receptive do you find, generally speaking, obviously this is a general question, but how receptive do you find them to that work? Because that's challenging to men who have been, programmed by the patriarchy in this way.
Well, I unfortunately, oftentimes they are there because my typical situation is that he is the one calling for therapy, but it usually is because she is got one foot out the door.
Yep.
Still, unfortunately, that is. I think sometimes if I have a couple that's younger, a couple more in their 30s, oftentimes they will come in as a very mutual decision. But men in their 40s, 50s, 60s, it is oftentimes either post somebody's infidelity, usually his infidelity,
yep, or
she's just on her very, very last legs. And I think that men come in with fear of being told that they're wrong. I think that's what men's fear of couples therapy oftentimes is that it's going to be 2 against 1.
Yes. And so I have a lot of women who are in that space who have been asking for therapy for years. And now they're done. And their husbands are like, wait, I'll go to therapy. And they're like, okay, fine, find someone. You find, because I've been doing the legwork for, 10, 12 years. If you want to go, find someone. So it doesn't surprise me that you see a lot of the men making a call, right? And God, that's the part that just breaks my heart, right? It breaks my heart because so many of these men really don't want to lose their wives, right? They really don't.
That's right.
And we as a society and as a culture have not set them up to be in healthy relationship, right? And it's so, so tragic.
It's why I love that my week has these 2 parts. One is sitting with, my couples tend to skew older. And then I get to sit with college students, right? And do a big, elaborate, in-depth relationship education course with college students. And I tell you what, there are tons of men in that class and they want to get it. There is a particular kind of pain that men who are doing this work have to confront, which the loss of what you thought it was to be a good man, the loss of looking at ways in which your father didn't measure up or grandfather, and how to hold on to all of that. But it is breaking those patterns and those cycles. It's courageous and it's beautiful and it's sad.
Oh, I think it's amazing. The course that you're talking about is your Marriage 101, right? And I think, right, is that right? Yeah. And I just think it's amazing. And I want that to be that should be curriculum in in like every college across the country and in high school, right? Like we should be teaching how to be in relationship with each other from the get-go. So I love that you're doing that. It like makes my heart like flutter. Like we all wish we had that, right? We all wish we had that class, for God's sake. 20 years worth of research and work, for both of us, right? Collected 40 years of research and work, wish we could have gotten at an early age. One of the things that I hear a lot in my work is about various levels of sexual coercion. And I think that's, there's a spectrum of coercion. There's subtle, but if you love me, you would do it, right? There's what you talk about in your book about desire discrepancy, which can have some manipulation in there, right? And then all the way up to marital rape, which I've done a lot of educating on women about the fact that what they're experiencing is actually marital rape, right? Because many of them, first of all, in many cultures, a man is entitled to a woman's body at any time. So that's not rape. I'm his wife, right? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about sort of the spectrum of coercion.
Well, it is the whole paradigm, and it's predicated upon the fact that we have not yet figured out how to help girls and women feel entitled to pleasure. Because the very moment that we reframe sex and we take it out, the duty-bound framework of sex, that sex is as a service, and that to be a good woman is to be sexually chaste and sexually modest, like that whole framework sets up that spectrum of coercion. Versus if we told girls from a very early age, you know what, there's a part of your body that feels real different to touch. And you are going to want to get under the covers and listen to Dr. Ruth. And that's not because you're a pervert. It's because you're a human and you have as much curiosity about sex as a boy does. We do a really big disservice when we kind of perpetuate these myths of sex is the only thing that boys want. And you have to be really careful that boys are only after one thing. Like that message right there is predicated upon the idea that she wouldn't maybe just want one thing. Like maybe she just kind of wants to, hook up with a boy and not think real hard about the consequences. But we don't make space for that. So then girls grow up splitting off their own sexual curiosity, their own sexual appetites, which is then we get a lot of messages around suppressing our appetites of all kinds. So that feels really natural. Like, oh yeah, well, I'm not supposed to feel hungry. I'm not supposed to feel horny. I'm just supposed to be in control of everything about me all the time. And so that starts to all kind of fit together and create the conditions whereby like women don't feel authorized to go into a sexual experience on equal footing. And men don't go into a sexual experience thinking that women need to be on equal footing, right? Because even how we teach consent, when we teach consent, we often teach no means no.
Right.
Which is so bare bones minimum, versus another model, which would be like great sex is like a jazz improvisation, right? Like you're both playing off each other. You have different instruments, you have the same instrument, but you're basically kind of riffing and flowing. And what makes it good is that you're kind of in sync and vibing together, which is just a very, very different, it's a different way in. Everybody gets to go into a sexual experience on the same footing with the same amount of power and voice and agency. But we can't get there until we start to bust up some of these myths. And the myth that male sexuality is inherently predatory, right? That's the other myth, is that male sexuality is inherently dangerous, and therefore everybody has to just be on lookout. And that's really all we can do is contain it. Like that's those stupid dress code rules, right? Where a tank top strap has to be this thick. Basically is saying like, listen, you guys, these boys are dangerous, versus teaching boys that of course you're going to notice lots and lots of things. And here's how you ground strong sexual energy in your body. Here's how you breathe with it. Here's how you contain it. Here's a very different world.
We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. Today's episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an online counseling service. They counsel more people worldwide than any other online service available. And I love BetterHelp. They will assess your needs and they'll match you with your own licensed professional therapist. You can start communicating with a therapist in under 24 hours. This is not a crisis line. It's not self-help. This is professional counseling done securely online. The service is available to clients worldwide. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your counselor, and you're going to get timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions, so you won't ever have to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room as with traditional therapy. I'll tell you that I know that I work with a lot of women who are not able to find a counselor in their area, right? Maybe they live in rural areas or otherwise it's difficult for them to find a counselor, and BetterHelp is probably your best bet out there. We have a special offer for the Divorce Survival Guide podcast listeners to get 10% off your first month. So go to betterhelp.com/divorce survival guide. Now that's BetterHelp, HELP, and join the over 500,000 people taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/divorce survival guide.
So we were talking about being on the same footing, right? And being on the same level of agency and power and all of that, right? And the thing that comes to my mind when we talk about that is trauma, and how, like, certainly as a woman of my age, right? The amount of sexual trauma that I've already experienced in my life, it feels to me, and I could be wrong, but it feels to me like any sexual relationship I enter into, I'm not going into on an equal footing, right? And you talk about that sort of triangle of risk. I can't remember all the other two, the other two things are in that, right? But it feels to me like my risk is higher as a woman who has suffered sexual trauma, sexual coercion, who has been raped, who was molested as a small child. Like, I mean, the list goes on, right? And I sort of downplay that because it's like, yeah, I'm a 49-year-old woman who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and like, of course, right? And that's a fucking horrible, sad state of affairs. But most women listening to this will have had some form of sexual trauma. And so it doesn't feel like I'm right. My level of risk feels a lot higher. And by the very nature of being a woman, in which I'm taking a man inside of me physically. Mm-hmm. So how does that square?
Well, it just, as you say it speaks to the urgency of male allyship.
Yes.
Right. It speaks to, because I think so often she feels like her job is to keep herself from dissociating and just try to show up for the experience. Like she's at risk of making it a one-person job. Managing my sexual trauma and how it's going to get activated when I make love to this partner is my job to take care of. She makes a we project into a me project. Mm-hmm. So I want men to be able to hold space, to be an intimate ally. I mean, I get chills saying it out loud, because I tell you what, like the times that I have the privilege of working with a couple where one person is healing from trauma and the other person is like, help me help you. Like, mm-hmm. I want to understand it. I want to be with you in it. I don't want to trigger you. It's beautiful work, because that right there is a kind of healing, right? It's sexual healing, just to say, talk to me about what you went through and where you need me to be vis-a-vis all of that, so that we can start to do this differently for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's gorgeous. That is so beautiful, right? And I think it's what so many women crave, right? We so crave that. And there's a vulnerability, which is another point in your triangle, isn't it?
It's risk, trust, and self-compassion.
Right. And so there's the trust, right? I always talk about trust requiring vulnerability, right? Like we have to, right? And so is risk. Risk is vulnerability, right? And so there's this vulnerability to piece but if you don't have that trust, if you don't have the trust piece, you cannot bring a level of risk into it, right? You just simply can't.
That's right.
And I think that from my experience, my personal sort of sexual history experience, right, is that women enter into sexual relationships before there's trust in order to build trust, or build intimacy, but we're actually creating the opposite, right? We're actually not. I recently have had this experience with someone where we've built 8-9 months of like deep intimacy with no sex, partly because he's been healing from his divorce and and he hasn't been ready. He's like, and so it's been great, but the level of intimacy that we've created, the trust is the most profound thing I've ever experienced. And this is a person that I'm not in an official relationship with, who's not, my partner. He doesn't even live in the country right now. Like, there's all sorts of things about it, but the level of trust and intimacy that we've created is by far greater than any actual intimate relationship I've ever been in,
Well, it's so beautiful. And you couldn't have done that without him. He has his own way of languaging for him. He's done some work on his interior. I think so often boys and men grow up using sex to regulate their own sense of worth.
Yes.
So when he's wanting to front load sex to build trust, really what he's trying to do is say, that's how I'm going to know that she likes me. If we have sex, that's how I'm going to really know that she likes me. Right. It's a way of regulating the internal angst that men feel. It becomes like the bar for knowing that I'm doing an okay enough job. I'm desirable enough. And so then men end up abandoning themselves. And this is a man who actually has done work to understand that his penis and his heart are profoundly connected to each other. Yeah. And that he wants as much to feel safe with you as you want to feel safe with him.
Yep, absolutely.
You couldn't have gotten there with him unless he had done that work on his own. You couldn't.
Absolutely. And there were a number of times where I was like, can we please have sex? And he was like, no. He was like, no. And I was like, grr!
That's a wise man. That's right. Very erotically charged with like that. No, I'm not there. That will get, yeah, that's good. Very good.
And
both strategic and psychologically minded on his part.
Yeah, it's really wonderful, but it's also been a healing relationship for me for a million reasons. But it's shown me too how many times I've entered into a sexual relationship with someone. I am the classic codependent woman, or have been, who has used sex to get love, who pretended sex equals love, and it has gotten me everything but. Like everything but.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. And it is, and I think you're speaking to the way that you're talking about it, as that is part of your narrative. You are at risk of doing that because part of surviving trauma, part of how one survives trauma is being able to exit the experience, right? So that sort of abandonment, distance, self-abandonment, taking yourself out is how one survives trauma. It's an incredibly important coping strategy to survive.
Yeah.
And it's so much the nature of being a woman is sort of like not checking in with ourselves anyway. So it's like the trauma and the gender socialization play off each other. And then this whole expectation that we need to give sex to get love is a third. It's like a 3-part unholy trinity of self-abandonment. And so you can see how this pattern just continues to play on itself. And it's so scary. It's scary to step out of. It's scary to say, actually, here's my boundary. Mm-hmm. And it's not a punitive boundary. It's not a manipulative boundary. It is me speaking my truth.
Yeah. And the most important thing in that is sort of not the most important thing, but something also very important in that is how that's received, right? Because if it is received well, right, the trust just like, it's like right there, right? If someone says, you tell this great story in your TED Talk of one of your students who was with a man, and what was it? He said like, he was asking for consent, right? And she said, "Will you tell it? Because it's so sweet."
In some ways, it's a little bit like what you're going through with this man that you're dating, where he's like no, and you're like, oh, really? So this man. So this is like 2 college students hooking up, and the guy says to my student, the young woman, the guy says, "Can I take off your shirt?" And she like shrugs her shoulders. That's what she always does, because that's how she goes through sex. Is it's just sort of like she just kind of she's just the brake pedal. And if she doesn't need to put on the brakes, then the guy can keep going. And he stops kissing her. And he's like, I'm not taking off your shirt until you tell me that you want me to take off your shirt. Right. So he like flips the script. He's like, I'm not going to settle for this. I'm going to keep going until you say stop. Like, that's not what I want. I want you to figure out what the hell you want from me. Like, what do you want us to do together? And she wasn't doing the shoulder shrug because she was trying to be whatever, coy, manipulative.
Right. Yeah.
It was just the only option she thought she had. Right.
So it's so amazing. It's just so, I always say like consent is so hot, really. Like when someone is genuinely asking what you want and if you want and can I and do you want, right? Not just can I, but do you want? It's like, oh my God, it's such a turn on.
Because what that man is saying to you is like, my power is grounded. Like I know exactly where my power center is and it's grounded. It's available, but it's not intrusive. Like I'm offering you something, but I need you to ground yourself and figure out what you want. It's very powerful, right? It's not power over, it's not dominant power, but it's for a man to be able to kind of hold on to his own center. Like, he's not asking like, am I doing a good job? Which is that's kind of not so hot because it's sort of.
Oh yeah. Right. No.
affirm me. But it's sort of like, listen, I got some good stuff to offer you, but I need to know if you're on board and I need to know that it's good. And is it good for you? And that's very hot. Very hot.
I want to go back to the sexual coercion, to the other side of it. Sort of, like I said, like marital rape is somewhat extreme, right? And I think that, just to state clearly, it's not okay. Marital rape is rape. There's no such thing, as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as marital rape. It's rape. And arguably made worse by the fact that it's someone that you're married to and should have a trusting relationship with. But what about desire discrepancy and how couples navigate that, and the good ways they navigate it, and then the really not good ways that they navigate it, because that's where some coercion, some like fucked up coercion comes in.
That's right. Absolutely. So desire discrepancy is completely unavoidable in a long-term sexually monogamous relationship, right? The chances of two people wanting the same kind of sex at the same frequency it's not realistic at all. And it tends to be the case that couples fall into a pattern of one person being the higher desire partner and one person being the lower desire partner. And the problems come especially, it's an especially problematic situation around coercion when it's a straight couple and when he is the higher desire partner and she's the lower desire partner.
Right.
So part of what I'm trying to do in this book is help women feel empowered enough that they can feel able to articulate what they would be up for, what they wouldn't be up for. And because that's a piece of it, right? Is if she gets like locked into this whole, it's my duty, it's my responsibility, I should give him what he wants, that just kind of keeps the cycle going.
Mm-hmm.
And if sex doesn't feel good, right? If she's having sex, it doesn't feel good because she hasn't explored her body. She doesn't know, she's sort of bought into this idea that penetration equals sex, which we've all, by the way, bought into. Which is, I think that makes the problem worse, right? So we say that sex is penetration, right? That's sort of, right. If you say the word sex, that's what comes to mind is penis and vagina sex.
Right.
It tends to not be the thing that feels the best for women. So oftentimes she's set up from the get-go to not enjoy sex that much because it's sort of like he may touch her for a little bit before he gets to stick his penis in. Well, who the hell wants that? So then... right. But if he hasn't learned, if nobody has really taught him, listen, dude, like that's your whole body is a pleasure center for you, right? Like when she touches you in all these places, actually, it feels really good for you. And your body is more expansive than just your penis. And by the way, her body is more expansive than just her vaginal opening. And there are parts of the pleasures of the journey versus like we do some stuff to get to the goal of penetration. Mm-hmm. So I think we are set up for desire discrepancy because we have these very narrow definitions of sex. And I think couples resolve it in healthy ways, in all kinds of ways. I think one option is that she may say, I'm not really available for penetration tonight, but I would be more than happy to give you a quick blowjob. or I'm not available for anything, but I would love to hold you and talk to you and be with you and be near you. And I love you and you're sexy, and not wanting you tonight says everything about my stress level and nothing about your attractiveness. So I think so we can soften the blow by giving a bit more context. Because I think what often happens is he feels rejected.
Right.
And she feels guilty.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the problems start.
Right. So I think, and the problem can begin with, how do men handle rejection? How has our society, or the patriarchy, everything back to what we were talking about before, how does it teach men to handle rejection? It teaches them to reject, right? I never wanted you anyway, or right,
or push harder. No, don't take no for an answer.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's where the manipulation comes in, is that if he can't tolerate rejection, and he's going to meet her rejection with either pouting or, trying to build a case, which also isn't very sexy, or guilt tripping, then sometimes she will just do it because she doesn't want to go. She's trying to bypass that whole cycle. So you're right. A lot of it is helping men have tools for tolerating, reframing rejection, because it is saying, I'm not available for that activity tonight. It's not a rejection of you as a person. It doesn't have to mean that. I think so often there's that false equivalence of, if she doesn't want sex, it means she rejects me as a person, or I'm not getting something I feel entitled to.
Right. So, and a lot of the problem too with women, right, is that then we say yes when we don't want to, right? We're like, okay, I'll just appease him tonight, right? That keeps us further and further and further away from understanding and owning our own sexuality, right? If we're only having sex because he wants to, because it's my duty, because I just want to keep the peace, because whatever, then we're not exploring. We're not open to exploring our own sexuality, because sex is just something we do to keep the peace.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And the distance grows. And there's a way in which then we're training our body. We're like conditioning our body then to relate to that body as icky, right? Like if I'm having sex with you, but I don't want to be having sex with you, what I'm pairing together are your body, your scent, your touch, your breath. I'm pairing that with ick, resentment. So we actually, in an attempt to solve the moment, we create the conditions for a deeper problem, which is now my body is becoming increasingly hardwired to be disturbed, disgusted, angry by your presence. And that right there is a massive intimacy killer.
That is. Is there coming back from that?
I think one thing is flipping the polarity. Like, I think one way that couples can do this is the higher desire partner just says, I'm done. I am neutral. You come get me when you want some. We are on your timeline. We are taking your lead. We do what you want, when you want, how you want. And that's it. It can be incredibly healing.
So if the high desire partner says, like, okay, I'm now, like, basically that you have control, you said that can be really healing for.
Yes. The same words can be said with love or with control. So we're assuming this is a person who's saying it with love, like saying, okay, legitimately, I don't like this any more than you do. It doesn't feel good to have like sort of charity sexual experiences with you because you feel badly. Like, I don't like this any more than you do. So as an attempted solution, I'm going to just drop the reins and let you pick them up, and you show me where, when, how. If it's said in a loving way, basically it's an invitation then for him, we're saying him in this example, him to just kind of hold space. And then the two of them as a couple can kind of learn about her desire, so it becomes a bit more like an experiment, like we're anthropologists together, or like we're working together to figure out what does your sexual self say? What is it wanting? What is it craving? What's the pace? What's the energy of it? And that can be what she needs to step into desire. If her desire has only ever been in response to what she thinks somebody else wants or what somebody else does want, then neither of them has really learned to listen to what does her desire want.
So what about the couples for whom there's not this loving, right? It's maybe not so loving, right? When you have somebody who is manipulative and sort of, has a higher desire level, but are using manipulative tools to try and secure that. How do you recommend couples talk about this? Women, if let's say, just because I work with women, so I'm hearing these stories from women, right? So, and I'm sure it goes both ways, but how do we talk about this safely when it doesn't feel that safe?
Right. It's such a dicey conversation, isn't it? Because I hate the idea of us telling women they need to do more on their side of the street in order to make this problem different, because it really is. Every sexual problem is a couple problem. So this is a couple problem. And I don't know when somebody's using, if our man in the situation is using manipulative techniques, it is either he's got an investment in control or he has a very, very small toolbox, right? He just doesn't have, it's a default. He doesn't have other ways of doing it. He's unskilled.
Yep.
Under that scenario, that can be fixed, right? He can get some more tools. It's got to be through couples therapy or through men's work or through his own individual therapy. He can get those. He can understand what are the traumas or hurts or wounds in his life that led him to equate sex with validation. What are the stories? What are the ways in which privilege has blinded him from his entitlement and the behaviors that he does when he feels entitled to something? He can do that work. She can't make him do that work. And unfortunately, the more she says, this isn't okay under this scenario, the more he's going to say, yes, it is. And I wouldn't have to do this if you would just.
Right.
So that cycle has to get broken, and she can't do it. She can make a choice to not participate in the cycle anymore, right? She can just say, that is not actually seductive. Your guilt tripping is not, nothing happening in my down there. It's not what we turn on.
Right.
She can give that feedback,
Right, exactly. And I think that's important, right? I think that in and of itself, from an agency perspective, that a woman could have the agency and the confidence to say to her husband, what you're saying to me right now is actually not turning me on. So if you want to engage in a sexual relationship with me, like, that's not doing it. And in a control dynamic like this one that we're talking about, that in itself would be radical for her to say.
Sure.
Right? For herself to have that much agency to say that to a partner, right?
Yes. Right. If historically what she's done is she's believed the story that a good wife would and a good partner should, then yes, she's stepping out of that. She's stepping out of that story that somehow he's right and I do have to give him this. And she's saying, you know what? Actually, no. Actually, that's not very hot. That's not, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're not enticing me right now.
Yeah, you're not turning me on.
If you want to talk about how to entice me, I may have some thoughts about that. I may actually need a little bit of time to masturbate on my own and do some discovery, read Alexandra's book and get back to you. Because maybe I don't even know, right? Maybe I don't even know what turns me on, what I need from you in order to tap into my erotic self. I may need some time, but that's a different conversation than you coming at me and saying a good wife should, and why aren't you? And what's wrong with you? But that conversation I'm actually not going to engage in anymore with you.
Yeah. I love it. This is so, so wonderful. So Alexandra, your book, Taking Sexy Back, is, I think it's must read. It's a must read. It's required reading, I think, for all women, right? Because I love that you look at sex through a cultural lens, through a relational lens, all of these different, there's a bunch of different lenses, right? What are the lenses? There's emotional, physical, relational, spiritual, mental, developmental, and cultural, right? And you start with cultural, which is one of my favorite topics of conversation. It's what I start my programs with too, right? And I think it's required reading. How to own your sexuality and create the relationships you want. Who doesn't want that?
Mm-hmm. And there is, we in talking about men and male allies, there's a chapter in the book for men who love and men who make love to women who are taking sexy back. And it's about everything we've been talking about today. It's a letter. It's an open letter that I write to the male reader saying, like, listen, if the woman in your life has just read this book, there's some stuff that I want you to know as she steps forward. Here's what I really want. Here's what she's really going to need from you as she breaks up these old scripts, these old stories, as she tries some new things out about her relationship with pleasure. She's going to need you to hold some space for her. She's going to need you to not get defensive. There's stuff that she carries that isn't your fault. It's bigger and older than you, but you are powerful in terms of your ability to hold space for her while she figures it out.
It's so great. That's so great. I love that you included that chapter. I think it's so important. So important. So beautiful. So where can everyone find you on all the interwebs?
All of the webs, several places. So my website is dralexandrasolomon.com, and I'm active on Instagram and Facebook. Yeah, my newsletter is a good way to keep in touch with upcoming events, all of which are now online, which is kind of lovely in some ways. There's just such wider access now. But the newsletter goes out just only once a month and keeps people in the loop.
I need to get on that. Note to self. That's so great. Alexandra, thank you so much. I strongly recommend that everyone gets Alexandra's book, which will be linked in the show notes. Obviously, Taking Sexy Back, available everywhere where you buy your books. Thank you so much, Alexandra.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at the Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.